So in the last video we were modeling that timer activity, and we have modeled until read self action. So now we will move to the next section of the modeling of timer. So after the read self action, we need to use a read structural feature action. A read structural feature action basically reads the structural feature and passes it next through its result bin. The read structural feature action can be a property which should be defined in structure before using it inside the read structural feature action. So here in our model, the read structural feature action reads the initial value of the timer, and the initial value has been given already in the timer block. We have modeled in the block definition diagram. Here is the timer block and the initial value, which is an integer value. So the initial value has a default value of 0. So the read structural feature action we will be using in our timer model will read that initial value here and passes it next through its result bin. So to add a read structural feature action, go to the node section of the palette, search for the read structural feature action, and here it is. Drag and drop it onto the palette. So you can rename it whatever you want. I'm using its default name. Okay. Now the structural feature it will be reading is the initial value of the timer block, and the initial value we have already set is 0. Initial value is basically the variable which has a value of 0, and this variable will be used as the structural feature of read structural feature action here. So to use this initial value variable as a structural feature of this read structural feature action, select this read structural feature action, go to the properties tab and search for the structural feature, and here it is. Now to add this initial value variable as a structural feature, click this button, not plus button but a 3-dot button, and search for the initial value variable in your SysML model. The initial value is basically declared in the timer block. Open the timer block and it's here. Select the initial value and click OK. Now the structural feature has been added, which is the initial value of the timer, which will basically considered as the initial value of timer, and we have set the value of initial value variable as 0, which means that the initial value of timer is now 0. So it also needs the timer object, which will be passed through the read self action. But this will accept the timer object through its object bin only, not directly. So to add an object bin, select this read structural feature action, go to the properties and here is the object. Click this button and the input pin, because object, it receives the object of timer as its input, so we need an input pin. Then you can name the input pin as whatever you want. Let's say I'm naming it as object. Rest of the things I'm taking as they are by default, and click OK. Now here is the object pin. Now you can also move this to the corresponding pin. Okay. Now this object will be passed through the read structural feature action through its object pin. So I need to use a fork node here, because the timer object should be passed to read structural feature action and add structural feature action, which will be used next in this model, and the send signal action, which will also be used in the next section of this model simultaneously. These three actions, read structural feature action, add structural feature action, and send signal action, needs the timer object simultaneously. So that's why we need to use the fork node. So to use a fork node, go to the node section of the palette, search for the fork node inside the nodes section, and here is the fork node. Just drag and drop it onto the palette. You can resize it as whatever you, as the way you want. Okay. Now we need to use the object flow, because this is passing an object. So an object is passed only through the object flow. So to use the object flow, go to the edges section, select the object flow, and drop it onto the pin from where you want to start the object flow, and drop it on where you want to end the object flow. Well, it can have guard and wait. The wait basically is the minimum number of tokens that transfers the edge, and the guard is basically the condition at runtime to determine if the edge can be traversed. So I'm not using any guard or wait conditions. Okay. Okay, now this object flow should be passed. Now this object flow should be passed to the read structural feature action through its object pin. So I need another object flow. Select the object flow. The object is now here at the fork node, and I want to pass it to the read structural feature action. I don't want to use any guard and wait conditions again, so we can remove it from the cross button here. Okay. Now the read structural feature action has read the value of the variable called initial value, which is basically the initial value of the timer, and we have set the initial value as 0 in block definition diagram. So now this read structural feature action will pass the structural features value, that is 0 here in our case, to the next through its result pin, which means that it must have a result pin also. To add a result pin, select the read structural feature action, go to the properties tab, and then in the result section click this plus button. It will then ask you for the creation of new output pin. You can name it as whatever you want. Let's say I'm naming it as result, and then click OK. So now the control is here. The read self action, the control is here at read self action, and the read self action will not start execution unless the control is passed from the read self action to the read structural feature action. So we need a control flow. To add a control flow, go to the edges section of the palette, select the control flow and drop it onto the element from where you want to pass the control to the next, and end it, and drop the control flow to the element where you want to end that control flow. Okay, now the control is here. The read structural feature action also have a timer object, and it has read the value of initial value of the timer and pass it to the next through its result pin. Okay, now we have to increment this structural feature, the initial value. We have to increment in the initial value of the timer. So to increment in the initial value, we have to use an opaque action. To add an opaque action, go to the node section, search for an opaque action, and here it is. Just drag and drop it onto the editor. Here is the opaque action. You can rename it whatever you want. Let's say I'm renaming it as increment. Now the increment basically is an opaque action. Opaque action can be written as opaque action can be written in any of the languages. So to write an opaque action, select the increment, select this opaque action, go to the UML tab of the properties, and then you have to select a language for this opaque action. That is, in which language you want to write this opaque action. Click this button, select any of these languages. Let's say I'm selecting natural language, then click this forward arrow button. This is important to click this forward arrow button, otherwise it will not take it as natural language, and then click OK. The editor of the natural language has been opened. Now the increment, the opaque action called increment has an action like t out is equal to t in plus 1. This is the action which this opaque action will be performing. So this opaque action will receive its structural feature through its read its structural feature through its input pin. So the input pin, to add an input pin to this opaque action, go to the node section of the palette, search for input pin. The input pin will be here in this pin section. Open this section. Here is the input pin. Just drag and drop it onto the opaque action. Here is the input pin, and I am naming it as T in. because I have used it in the body of the opaque action. So tin will be the input. So now I need to use the object flow, because the structural feature from the read structural feature will be passed to the increment through the object flow, and that structural feature will be saved in tin in the opaque action. So to use the object flow, go to the edges section of the palette, select the object flow and drop it onto the element from where you want to start the object flow. Just from like I'm dropping it onto the result and drop it onto the element where you want to end that object flow, like this. So I do not want to use any wait and guard conditions, so I'm removing guard condition like this and wait like this. Okay, now the control should also be passed from read structural feature action to in opaque action. So to add a control flow, go to the edges section of the palette here and select the control flow and drop it onto the element from where you want to start the control flow. The control is basically here right now, and I am passing the control from here to the increment. Okay, now this tin will be incremented here in this action. Here it is, and will be passed through itstout pin. Tout will be the output pin of the opaque action. So which means that this opaque action should have an output pin. To add an output pin, go to the nodes section of the palette, open the pins section. Here is the output pin. Just drag and drop it onto the opaque action. Here is the output pin. You can rename the pin as go to the properties and then UML tab. You can rename it as tout because we have used the name tout in the body of the opaque action called increment. Tout. So you can move it to here. Now we want to use we need to use the add structural feature action. Add structural feature action basically overrides the value of the initial value variable, overrides the value of the structural feature. So we need to use the add structural feature action. So to add structural feature action, go to the node section of the palette, search for the add structural feature action. It's not shown directly here, so open this one. It's not here. Open this one. It's not here. Open this one. It's here. Add structural feature value action. So just drag and drop it onto the editor. Add structural feature value action. I'm using default name, so here it is. Add structural feature action. Oh, sorry. Add structural feature action basically overrides the value of structural feature, because the value of structural feature, the structural feature we have given here has the value 0. Now that structural feature has been saved into thistout variable. Okay, let me delete this one, and the next part of the timer activity will be explained in the next video. Thank you.